In the summer of 1944, the Driniumor River in northern New Guinea marked not only a water barrier, but the forward edge of Allied control along the coast west of Aitapi. The area formed part of the wider Southwest Pacific Theater, where Allied strategy aimed to move stepwise toward the Philippines, while isolating major Japanese bases such as Wewak and Rabaul. The Allied advance along the New Guinea coast had already seized Lae, Finschhafen, and Sidor, and by April 1944, United States forces had conducted an amphibious landing at Aitape to secure airfields and protect the flank of operations further west. The Driniumor line emerged from this sequence as a defensive screen rather than a primary objective in itself. For Japan, the same coastline had a different meaning. The 18th Army, subordinate to the 8th Area. Army headquartered at Rabaul had been pushed back from earlier positions in eastern New Guinea and was increasingly cut off from direct supply routes. Several divisions and independent mixed brigades, including elements of the 20th and 41st Divisions, were concentrated around Wewak and its hinterland. Their leadership faced a strategic dilemma: remain on the defensive and risk being bypassed and starved, or attempt an offensive to disrupt Allied plans and regain room for maneuver. Within this context, the area east of Aitape, where the Driniumor ran roughly parallel to the coast before bending inland, became a potential axis for a renewed Japanese effort. Allied command arrangements reflected the progressive buildup of American forces in the Southwest Pacific. Overall direction in the theater rested with General Douglas MacArthur, while ground operations in the Aitape sector were assigned to the U.S. 6th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger. At the local level, the defense of the Driniumor line involved primarily U.S. Army units, such as the 32nd Infantry Division and separate regimental combat teams, supported by engineers, artillery, and service troops responsible for building and maintaining airstrips and supply points around Aitape. Australian forces operated further east along the coast, but did not yet take over the Aitape sector. Coordination with the Royal Australian Air Force and U.S. 5th Air Force provided air cover and interdiction capabilities against Japanese movements west of Wewak. Japanese command on the opposite side centered on Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the 18th Army. His formations had suffered earlier losses from fighting, disease, and supply shortages during the long retreat from eastern New Guinea. Estimates of effective strength in the Wewak-Aitape area in mid-1944 vary, but Japanese records and Allied intelligence both indicate that the number of troops potentially available for an offensive along the Driniumor sector ran into the tens of thousands, though many were undernourished and lacked full equipment. The choice to commit these forces to a westward attack was influenced by imperial directives to resist Allied advances and by local assessments that striking the Aitape perimeter offered the best chance to disrupt Allied preparations for further operations. Intelligence and reconnaissance shaped the assumptions on both sides. Allied aerial photography and Coastwatcher reports indicated continued Japanese concentrations around Wewak and signs of movement inland along tracks that could lead toward Aitape. Signals intelligence and prisoner interrogations suggested that Japanese forces retained offensive intent, despite logistical difficulties. However, assessments differed over the likely scale and timing of any attack, leading to debates within the Allied command about how far forward to place defensive positions and how many troops to commit to static defense versus mobile reserves. Japanese intelligence about Allied dispositions around Aitape and the Driniumor was constrained by Allied air superiority and the difficulties of ground reconnaissance in dense jungle. The terrain between Wewak and Aitape imposed severe practical limitations. The coastal plain was relatively narrow, backed by steep foothills, and intersected by multiple rivers, including the Driniumor and its tributaries. Inland, thick jungle, swamps, and ridges restricted movement to narrow tracks. For the Allies, this environment complicated supply, but also allowed a comparatively small force, supported by artillery and air power, to defend key crossing points. For the Japanese, the same terrain offered cover for infiltration, but made it difficult to move heavy weapons and sustain large formations. The local climate, with heavy rainfall and high humidity, contributed to disease and wear on equipment for both armies. Civilian populations in the area, primarily Papuan and New Guinean communities living in small villages and mission stations, experienced the buildup to the battle through displacement and forced labor. Some inhabitants were evacuated or relocated by Allied authorities as the Ayatape base expanded. Others were drawn into carrying supplies, guiding patrols, or providing information about enemy movements, sometimes under Allied direction and sometimes under Japanese coercion, depending on which side held local control at a given time. The population had already lived through earlier phases of the New Guinea campaign, including Japanese occupation and Allied air raids, so the emergence of the Driniumor as a new front line represented a continuation rather than a sudden transformation of wartime conditions. Public sentiment in the main belligerent countries reflected the broader strategic picture rather than the specific sector. In the United States, attention in mid-1944 focused on operations in the Central Pacific, the Marianas, and the European theater following the Normandy landings. The fighting in New Guinea was often reported as part of a sequence of advances along MacArthur's axis toward the Philippines, with limited detail about individual river lines or local engagements. In Japan, official announcements emphasized resistance across a wide arc from Burma to the Central Pacific, while censorship and war weariness limited public understanding of the specific challenges facing isolated armies such as the 18th in New Guinea. The decisions that would lead to the Battle of the Driniumor River thus arose less from public pressure than from military assessments of how to manage shrinking resources and expanding fronts. By late June 1944, the preconditions for a clash along the Driniumor were in place. Allied forces held Ayatape and had extended their outposts forward to the river, constructing defensive positions along selected bends and likely crossing sites. Japanese formations, regrouping west of Wewak, began to move through the interior toward the same line, planning to concentrate sufficient strength to attempt a breakthrough toward Ayatape. The combination of diverging strategic aims, Allied emphasis on securing a base and flank protection, Japanese emphasis on regaining initiative despite supply constraints, set the stage for a battle in which geography, logistics, and prior attrition would weigh as heavily as numerical strength. By late June 1944, preparations for an offensive and counteroffensive along the Driniumor shifted from concept to concrete movement. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi's 18th Army issued orders for a westward attack with the objective of striking the Ayatape perimeter. Elements of the 20th Division, the 41st Division, and smaller attached units began to move from assembly areas east of the Driniumor, using inland tracks and covered routes to avoid Allied air observation. Columns advanced in dispersed groups, carrying limited rations and ammunition because of transport shortages, with heavier supplies moved by porters and handcarts along jungle paths. At the same time, U.S. forces around Ayatape consolidated their forward positions along the Driniumor line. The 32nd Infantry Division, with regiments such as the 126th and 127th Infantry, shared responsibility with units like the 112th Cavalry Regimental Combat Team for manning outposts, patrol bases, and defensive strongpoints along the river. Company and platoon positions were sited near likely crossing points, using natural bends, sandbars, and small ridges as reference points. Engineers improved trails and erected wire obstacles, while artillery units registered pre-planned fire missions along the eastern bank to disrupt any attempted crossings. Local command structures were refined to respond quickly to a possible attack. At division level, American headquarters organized the sector into zones, each under a regimental commander who coordinated infantry, artillery, engineers, and service elements. Forward observers and liaison officers linked the river defense line to the artillery and to air support. Communications relied on field telephones where possible, backed by radio nets and runners in case lines were cut by weather or enemy action. Behind the river, reserve battalions remained on alert near key tracks leading back to Ayatape and its airfields. For Adachi's command, the opening phase required synchronizing movements of widely scattered units under conditions of limited radio communication. Orders were relayed through couriers and local headquarters, which had to contend with terrain that slowed every march and complicated the concentration of forces. Japanese planning called for assembling several regiments near the Driniumor, then launching a coordinated night assault to penetrate the U.S. line, destroy local reserves, and push toward Aitapi. The expectation was that surprise, proximity, and the commitment of multiple units on a narrow front could compensate for shortages in heavy artillery and vehicles. Intelligence estimates framed the initial decisions on both sides. U.S. patrols operating east of the Driniumor reported increased signs of enemy activity in late June. New tracks, abandoned campsites, and occasional clashes with small Japanese parties. Aerial reconnaissance identified fresh clearings and movement in the interior, but foliage and cloud cover limited precise counting of troops. Allied analysts concluded that the Japanese might attempt local attacks or raids, yet there was disagreement over whether they could mass enough personnel and supplies for a large-scale offensive after earlier losses in New Guinea. Japanese reconnaissance detachments, in turn, tried to map the disposition of U.S. positions along the river. Small groups crossed the Driniumor at night or moved close to American outposts to determine sentry patterns and estimate the density of the defensive line. These patrols reported that the river line was held but not uniformly fortified, with some stretches appearing more lightly manned than others. However, the need to avoid detection and the difficulty of sustained observation in the jungle meant that Japanese commanders worked with incomplete data about American reserves and artillery strength. The first clashes of this phase were limited engagements rather than full-scale assaults. In late June and the first days of July, U.S. and Japanese patrols encountered each other in the dense undergrowth east of the river, exchanging fire at short range before disengaging. These contacts confirmed that Japanese units were present in significant numbers, but did not yet reveal the full extent of their concentration. For the American units holding the Driniumor, the effect was to increase alertness and reinforce nightly stand-to routines, while daytime work on positions and supply lines continued. Geographically, the Driniumor itself defined how the opening phase unfolded. The river's width and depth varied along its course, with some sections shallow enough for wading during certain tide and rainfall conditions, and others forming deeper channels. Seasonal rains influenced current strength and bank erosion, altering crossing conditions from week to week. U.S. forces used this variability when assigning sectors, concentrating stronger defenses at the most obvious approaches while relying on patrols and listening posts in areas judged less likely to be used by a large attacking force. Japanese planners, aware of these patterns, sought to identify crossing sites that combined concealment with access to inland tracks leading toward Aitapi. Logistically, both sides faced immediate constraints even before the main battle began. American supply arrangements used coastal shipping, motor transport, and air delivery to stock forward dumps near the Driniumor, ensuring that infantry companies could draw rations, ammunition, and medical supplies without overlong carries. Japanese units moving west from Wewak, by contrast, depended heavily on human porters and limited pack animals, with many soldiers required to carry both weapons and food over long distances. This difference affected the pace of Japanese concentration. Some units reached their start lines earlier than others, forcing adjustments to the tentative schedule for the opening attack. By the first week of July 1944, both command structures had essentially completed their initial deployment. On the American side, company and battalion commanders along the Driniumor adjusted arcs of fire, coordinated with supporting mortars and artillery, and arranged fallback positions in case of a breakthrough. On the Japanese side, regimental and battalion staffs finalized plans for night crossings and subsequent advances inland from the river. The stage was set for a transition from patrolling and probing fire to an organized assault, in which the decisions made during this opening phase about where to commit reserves and how to use terrain would heavily influence the course of the fighting that followed. Strategic concepts on both sides took shape around the same terrain, but projected different expectations onto it. For the United States Command, Aitapi and the Driniumor line were components of a larger operational design aimed at securing the New Guinea coast while preparing for advances toward the Vogelkop and, ultimately, the Philippines. The Aitapi garrison, with roughly 23,000 personnel in the wider area, was expected to hold a defensible perimeter, protect the airfields, and prevent any Japanese concentrations from threatening Allied shipping and air routes. The Driniumor was chosen as an advanced security line, far enough east to give early warning of large movements, yet close enough to allow rapid reinforcement from the Aitape base. Japanese planning approached the same geography with an offensive intent. Lieutenant General Adachi and his staff framed what became the Aitape operation as an effort to regain the initiative and prevent the 18th Army from being immobilized around Wewak. Estimates of available combat troops for the attack, primarily from the 20th and 41st Divisions with attached units, were on the order of 20,000 men, though many lacked full equipment and were weakened by previous campaigns. The operational goal was to break through the American line along the Driniumor, drive west toward Aitape, and damage or destroy the airfield complex enough to delay further Allied advances in New Guinea. Doctrinal assumptions shaped how these goals were turned into specific plans. U.S. forces relied on a combination of linear defense and mobile reserves, using prepared positions at key river bends, and the ability to concentrate artillery and air power against any attempted crossing. The Driniumor was integrated into a defensive system that included observation posts, coordinated fields of fire, and pre-planned artillery concentrations. The concept was not to hold every meter of riverbank with continuous trenches, but to maintain a network of strong points supported by responsive firepower and backed by battalion and regimental reserves that could counterattack. Japanese doctrine, refined through years of fighting in China and earlier phases of the Pacific War, emphasized night movement, infiltration, and sudden close-range attacks. The plan for the Driniumor sector called for multiple regiments to assemble east of the river, cross under cover of darkness at selected points, and then fan out to attack American positions from the flanks and rear. Commanders hoped that terrain and darkness would limit the effectiveness of U.S. artillery and air support, allowing Japanese infantry to close quarters range, where training and cohesion could offset disadvantages in heavy weapons. Logistics and supply lines were central to both planning processes, although their practical realities differed sharply. U.S. 6th Army staff built the Aitape base around coastal shipping, motor transport, and air resupply. Ammunition, food, and engineering materials could be brought in by sea, unloaded at beaches or makeshift jetties, and moved forward along improving road networks and trails. Forward dumps behind the Driniumor ensured that units in the line could be sustained for extended periods, and field hospitals and evacuation routes were established to handle casualties. For the 18th Army, logistics were a constraint rather than an enabler. Supplies moved westward from Wewak, largely by hand, with soldiers and impressed laborers carrying rice, ammunition, and medical stores along narrow tracks. Earlier air and sea interdiction had reduced stockpiles, so rations for the Aitape operation were limited, and many units marched with only a few days of food. Artillery ammunition was scarce, and few guns could be brought close to the river because of terrain and transport problems. Japanese planners accepted these limitations as the cost of mounting any offensive at all, calculating that speed, surprise, and determination might compensate for shortages. Intelligence assessments contributed to miscalculations on both sides. Allied analysts recognized that Japanese troops remained in strength around Wewak, but some estimates assumed that disease and malnutrition had reduced their capacity for major offensive operations. The possibility of a significant attack was acknowledged, yet early planning tended to consider it more likely that the Japanese would conduct raids and probing actions rather than commit much of the 18th Army to a single operation. This influenced decisions about how many combat units to keep forward on the Driniumor and how large a reserve to maintain. Japanese intelligence about American forces at Aitape was incomplete. Reconnaissance and observation suggested that U.S. units were deployed along an extended front, and that some sectors appeared relatively lightly held, but there was less clarity about the depth of reserves, the density of artillery, and the degree of air support available at short notice. Some Japanese staff officers judged that the Aitape garrison, though sizable, might be vulnerable to a concentrated blow if taken by surprise. Others expressed concern that Allied firepower could rapidly offset initial gains. The decision to proceed reflected both the desire to act and the lack of a clear alternative in the face of increasing isolation. Propaganda and official communications framed the upcoming operation differently for domestic audiences and frontline troops. U.S. communiques referred to New Guinea fighting in general terms, highlighting continued progress along the coast and the establishment of bases such as Aitape, without detailing every river line. For American soldiers in the sector, briefings emphasized the need to hold the Driniumor, protect the airfields, and prevent Japanese forces from gaining observation or artillery positions within range of the base. Japanese orders of the day portrayed the planned offensive as an opportunity to strike a significant blow against the U.S. advance and demonstrate that the 18th Army remained a coherent fighting force despite isolation. By early July 1944, the planning cycle had converged on concrete timetables. Japanese headquarters fixed target dates for the concentration of units and the launching of initial assaults across the Driniumor. American commands along the river refined alert states, patrol schedules, and contingency plans for withdrawal or counterattack if specific positions were overrun. Both sides entered the next phase believing that their chosen combination of terrain usage, troop deployment, and doctrine could produce favorable results, even though the underlying logistical and intelligence factors pointed in different directions. On the night of July 10th to 11th, 1944, the Driniumor sector shifted from patrolling to open battle. After days of movement through the interior, Japanese assault units from the 20th and 41st Divisions reached their designated approach routes east of the river. Under cover of darkness and heavy rain, small groups began to move down to the water's edge, using the sounds of the current and jungle insects to mask their approach. At several points along a front of roughly 15 to 20 kilometers, infantry crossed on improvised rafts or waded through shallower channels, carrying light machine guns and mortars on their shoulders. On the western bank, American outposts manned by elements of the 112th Cavalry and infantry companies from regiments such as the 127th maintained routine night watch procedures, listening posts close to the water, sentries at likely crossing sites, and prearranged fire signals to alert nearby positions. Shortly after midnight, these forward elements reported unusual movement and isolated rifle shots from the eastern side. Within a short time, Japanese assault groups opened fire with grenades and automatic weapons at close range, aiming to overwhelm individual foxholes and small bunkers before artillery or mortars could be brought fully into action. Initial engagements were fragmented and localized. In some sectors, American outposts detected the approach in time to call for mortar fire and repel the first crossing attempts, inflicting casualties on exposed groups caught in the riverbed. In other stretches, Japanese units succeeded in crossing in greater numbers, infiltrating between positions and attacking from the rear. Where wire entanglements and cleared fields of fire had been fully completed, defenders were able to direct concentrated small arms fire along the riverbank. Where terrain or earlier assessments had led to thinner coverage, small groups of attackers managed to establish footholds on the western side. As the night progressed, reports reached battalion and regimental headquarters that sections of the forward line had been penetrated. Some platoons found themselves partially encircled, with Japanese detachments cutting telephone lines and firing into command posts and mortar positions. In these circumstances, American junior leaders had to decide whether to hold isolated positions or conduct local withdrawals to secondary lines prepared further to the rear. In several areas, small groups disengaged under fire and moved along narrow tracks toward rally points, while others remained in place and fought until ammunition or communication failed. Terrain conditions shaped the immediate outcomes. At bends where the river widened and current was strong, crossing attempts remained hazardous and costly. In narrower, more overgrown stretches, attackers could exploit cover right up to the water's edge and move quickly once across. The mixture of sandbars, cut banks, and swampy margins meant that no single tactical pattern applied along the whole front. This variability contributed to an uneven picture by dawn. Some U.S. positions remained intact, others had been abandoned, and several pockets of Japanese troops held ground west of the Driniumor. Civilian presence in the immediate combat zone was limited, as many villages near the Aitape base had already been evacuated or partially emptied earlier in the campaign. Nevertheless, groups of local inhabitants and impressed laborers were still moving along inland tracks during this period, carrying supplies or attempting to avoid both armies. The sudden eruption of fighting along the river forced some to flee deeper into the bush or seek shelter in temporary camps established under Allied supervision near the rear areas. For those living further east, the westward movement of Japanese units and the concentration of forces closer to the Driniumor meant renewed exposure to requisitions of food, labor, and shelter. By morning on July 11th, the pattern of the first major assault was clearer to both sides. American headquarters received consolidated reports indicating that Japanese forces had achieved penetrations at several points, and that some forward companies had taken significant casualties or disappeared from contact. Rough estimates suggested that hundreds of Japanese troops now held positions on the western bank, with additional units still crossing or assembling east of the river. Initial U.S. casualty figures for the night ran into the dozens killed and wounded, with some men missing from overrun outposts. Japanese losses were more difficult to assess, but evidence from the river crossings and immediate aftermath indicated that substantial numbers had fallen under artillery and small arms fire during the approach and crossing. For the Japanese assault units, the first night's results were mixed. In some regimental sectors, commanders reported successful crossings and the capture of American positions, confirming that surprise and night tactics had yielded tangible gains. In others, heavy fire and disorganization at the riverbank led to delays, dispersal, and higher-than-expected casualties before contact could be made. The need to coordinate follow-on waves with the units already engaged on the western bank posed a new challenge, especially under continuing Allied artillery fire and with limited communications. Morale on both sides reflected these initial outcomes in different ways. For American troops in sectors that held, the night's fighting reinforced confidence in defensive preparations and the effectiveness of artillery support once the enemy's presence was confirmed. For those forced to withdraw or reorganize after losing ground, the experience underscored the difficulty of maintaining a continuous line in jungle terrain against determined night attacks. Among Japanese units that had crossed successfully, the first footholds west of the Driniumor seemed to validate the concept of the operation, but the cost in casualties and the fragmented nature of the gains raised questions about how far and how fast they could push toward Aitape. By the end of the first day of large-scale contact, the Driniumor line could no longer be described as a continuous barrier. It had become a zone of interpenetrating positions, contested tracks, and shifting small unit engagements extending inward from the river. The opening clash had thus transformed the operational map. Instead of a clear dividing line, both commands now faced a fluid situation in which decisions about committing reserves, adjusting artillery fire plans, and redefining local objectives would determine whether the initial Japanese crossings would expand into a sustained advance or be contained and rolled back. In the days immediately after the 11th of July, 1944, the engagement along the Driniumor expanded from a series of penetrations into a wider crisis for both commands. Japanese assault forces, now estimated by U.S. staff at several thousand men west of the river, with additional elements still crossing, sought to widen and exploit the breach in the American line. Regiments from the 20th Division, including the 78th and 88th Infantry, along with elements of the 237th Infantry Regiment, pushed inland from their bridgeheads, attempting to drive a wedge between the northern and southern U.S. sectors and open routes toward Aitape. For the U.S. defenders, the key problem became one of cohesion. The initial breach had opened a gap of more than a kilometer in the center of the Driniumor line, and forced some companies, including parts of the 128th Infantry Regiment, to fall back through dense jungle under pressure. By July 12th, frontline positions no longer formed a continuous arc, but a series of clusters oriented on terrain features such as Coronal Creek and the X-Ray River, roughly 4 to 5 kilometers west of the original river line. The northern sector closer to the coast and the southern sector inland were in danger of becoming separated if Japanese forces could establish firm control of the tracks between them. Reinforcement and redistribution of units accelerated. 11th Corps headquarters authorized the commitment of additional infantry from the 124th Infantry Regiment, drawn from the 31st Division, to strengthen the center and restore contact between the fragmented sectors. Artillery support intensified. At least 3 105mm howitzer battalions, including the 125th, 129th, and 149th Field Artillery Battalions, were brought fully into action, along with 155mm guns from the 181st Field Artillery Battalion. Fire plans were revised to create belts of indirect fire across likely Japanese approach routes rather than concentrating solely on the riverbank, reflecting the shift from stopping crossings to containing forces already west of the Driniumor. On the Japanese side, the same period was characterized by attempts to maintain momentum in the face of growing strains. Units that had achieved early gains now had to fight in terrain, where every movement required cutting paths and carrying supplies by hand. Communications between regimental and divisional headquarters were frequently disrupted by distance, terrain, and U.S. artillery fire. Reports from forward battalions emphasized the need for ammunition and food as much as tactical progress. Adachi's staff faced the challenge of coordinating multiple regiments pushing through overlapping sectors without clear lines of demarcation or reliable radio contact. Casualties mounted for both armies. U.S. records from this phase already counted several hundred men killed, wounded, or missing across the 32nd Division and attached regiments. The 112th Cavalry and 124th Infantry, operating on exposed flanks and in counterattacks, began to accumulate losses that would rise significantly over the following weeks. Japanese units advancing through concentrated artillery and mortar fire, as well as close combat in confined jungle spaces, suffered higher losses. Later estimates for the entire battle suggest that between 8,000 and 10,000 Japanese personnel became casualties by late August, including combat and non-combat causes, with a substantial portion of these occurring during the July offensives. Command and control difficulties were not confined to one side. U.S. commanders, including 11th Corps and 32nd Division headquarters, had to interpret incomplete and sometimes contradictory reports from forward units whose positions had shifted during night engagements. Maps were often approximate, with local names for creeks and ridges differing between patrols and staff documents. This affected decisions about where to commit reserves, how to designate artillery target areas, and when to authorize local withdrawals or counterattacks. In several instances, the same patch of jungle was reported as held by different units at different times, illustrating the fluidity of the front. Morale and endurance came under increasing pressure. For American soldiers, the abrupt transition from static defense along a known river line to fighting in dense jungle, with the possibility of Japanese forces in their rear, imposed constant strain. Units had to adapt to operating in small groups, navigating by compass and landmarks rather than fixed trenches. For Japanese infantry, the need to carry supplies over long distances, combined with restricted rations and exposure to artillery, increased fatigue levels even before they reached close combat. Many had already experienced previous campaigns in New Guinea, and the conditions along the Driniumor reinforced a sense of operating at the edge of their logistical capacity. Politically and strategically, the events at the Driniumor remained part of a broader pattern, rather than a distinct crisis in public discourse. In Washington, the fighting was monitored within the context of the overall New Guinea campaign and preparations for operations against the Philippines. In Tokyo, reports from the 18th Army were integrated into larger assessments of the Southwest Pacific, where Japanese forces from Burma to the Central Pacific faced similar pressures. Neither leadership viewed the Driniumor in isolation, but both recognized that the ability or inability to hold or disrupt bases like Aitapi influenced the timeline and shape of later operations. By mid-July, the battlefront extended beyond the immediate river area into the hinterland around Afua and other inland localities. Japanese units sought to seize and retain high ground and village sites that could serve as staging areas for further advances. U.S. forces responded with local counterattacks, trying to restore a continuous line and protect tracks leading back to Aitapi. The escalation thus transformed the Driniumor engagement from a single river crossing battle into a multi-axis struggle over control of key terrain west of the river, with both commands facing increasing casualties, supply difficulties, and decision-making under uncertainty. By the second half of July 1944, the fighting west of the Driniumor reached its most intense phase. Japanese forces that had crossed earlier in the month continued to press toward the inland village of Afua, and the tracks leading from there to the Aitape perimeter. Regiments from the 20th Division, including the 78th and 88th Infantry, were reinforced by elements of the 237th Infantry Regiment, forming the core of the assault group in this sector. Their immediate objective was to seize and hold Afua, which lay several kilometers west of the river, and functioned as a local junction for trails running north to the coast and south into the foothills. For the U.S. command, Afua now became the focal point of the campaign. The 112th Cavalry Regiment, dismounted and operating as infantry, held positions in and around the village, supported by battalions from the 127th Infantry Regiment on the southern flank. Reinforcements from the 124th Infantry Regiment, previously committed to restoring the line after the initial breach, were redirected to stabilize this inland front. Artillery batteries that had first been sighted to cover river crossings adjusted their fire plans to concentrate on the Afua area and the approaches leading to it, turning the village and surrounding ridges into the center of a dense network of indirect fire. Japanese attacks around Afua came in waves. Around 15 to 16 July, elements of the 20th Division launched coordinated assaults against the southern portion of the Allied line, resulting in close-range engagements involving companies and squadrons operating in fragmented jungle compartments. Over the following days, Japanese units managed on at least 2 occasions to enter and temporarily control parts of Afua, forcing the 112th Cavalry and attached infantry to withdraw to nearby high ground and reorganize. U.S. counterattacks, supported by artillery and limited airstrikes, then pushed many of these detachments back, producing a pattern of repeated capture and loss of the same positions within a short time. This period also saw the heaviest use of supporting arms in the entire campaign. Australian Beaufighters and Beauforts from No. 71 Wing, operating under Allied Air Command, flew ground attack missions against suspected Japanese concentrations east and west of the Driniumor, while U.S. aircraft from units such as the 110th Reconnaissance Squadron provided additional strikes and reconnaissance from airfields around Aitape and Sidor. Off the coast, cruisers and destroyers of Task Force 74, including Australian and U.S. ships, delivered naval gunfire against barge routes and coastal positions, while smaller craft and PT boats attempted to disrupt Japanese barge movements between Wewak and the Driniumor sector. Despite this support, the strain on the ground units was considerable. The 112th Cavalry, engaged almost continuously from early July, fought for more than 7 weeks in the Driniumor and Afua sectors. Later, summaries noted that the regiment incurred losses affecting over half of its personnel during the campaign. Infantry battalions from the 32nd and 31st Divisions, including the 124th and 127th Infantry Regiments, also experienced sustained casualties and fatigue, with repeated night alerts, patrols, and counterattacks along narrow jungle tracks. Over the entire battle, U.S. forces would lose 440 killed, 2,550 wounded, and 10 missing, while Japanese casualties for the operation are estimated between 8,000 and 10,000, including deaths from combat, disease, and starvation. A large proportion of these occurred during the peak fighting in July. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Adachi committed additional resources in an effort to transform footholds into a decisive breakthrough. He ordered the reserve 66th Infantry Regiment, drawn from the 51st Division, forward to join the 20th and 41st Divisions, in renewed attacks around Afua and the southern approaches, bringing the total number of troops involved in the offensive to roughly 20,000. However, shortages in food and ammunition limited what these reinforcements could achieve. Even as new units arrived near the front, others were already experiencing low ration scales and reduced small arms and mortar ammunition, conditions that affected both tactical endurance and medical outcomes. Command decisions during this peak phase reflected the cumulative impact of weeks of fighting. U.S. 11th Corps Headquarters, under Major General Charles P. Hall, judged that continued passive defense risked further Japanese penetration and additional strain on frontline regiments. Planning therefore began for a larger counteroffensive to be launched from the northern coastal sector. using the 124th and 169th Infantry Regiments to cross east of the Driniumor, advance to Niamen Creek, and then pivot south and west in an attempt to envelop Japanese forces engaged around Afua. This design sought to exploit Allied mobility and supply advantages, while forcing Japanese units, already under pressure, to fight on multiple axes. For civilians in the wider region, the peak of the campaign meant further disruption. Villages near the Afua track network and along the coastal approaches were used as temporary headquarters, aid stations, or supply points by both sides at different times. Local inhabitants were called upon to act as carriers, guides, or laborers, often under compulsion and with limited provisions. Areas already affected by earlier phases of the New Guinea campaign now saw additional crop destruction, abandonment of gardens, and displacement toward more remote locations, contributing to longer-term economic and social effects that extended beyond the formal end of the battle. By late July, both commands recognized that the battle had reached a decisive intensity. Japanese forces, having committed much of the 18th Army's available combat strength in this sector, faced the dual pressure of heavy casualties and diminishing supplies. U.S. forces, though better supplied, had engaged much of the 11th Corps' infantry in continuous operations along and beyond the Driniumor. The stage was set for the next phase, in which the planned Allied counteroffensive and Japanese efforts to sustain their forward positions would determine whether the campaign's peak would lead to a successful Japanese consolidation west of the river or to a shift in momentum back toward the Ayatape base. Adaptation on both sides emerged first at the company and battalion level, as units adjusted to the realities of a dispersed, jungle-centered battle. For U.S. forces, the loss of a fixed river line meant that small groups had to operate with greater autonomy. Platoons from the 112th Cavalry and Infantry Battalions of the 124th and 127th Regiments began to work in combined teams, pairing rifle squads with machine gun sections, mortars, and scouts familiar with local tracks. Patrols shifted from short-range reconnaissance to deliberate sweeps designed to locate Japanese pockets, mark them for artillery, and test their defenses before committing larger forces. Japanese units also adapted, refining their use of terrain and night movement. After the initial assaults, commanders in the 20th Division adjusted their tactics to emphasize infiltration around U.S. strongpoints, rather than repeated frontal attacks against positions pre-registered by artillery. Small groups moved through secondary jungle paths, attempting to bypass American concentrations near Afua and strike supply routes and command posts instead. This approach sought to exploit their experience in close terrain and partially offset the disadvantage in heavy weapons. Supply and resource management became central concerns. The U.S. command introduced more systematic use of airdrops and forward supply dumps to sustain the infantry operating beyond the Driniumor. Pack trains, jeeps where tracks permitted, and native carriers moved rations, ammunition, and medical supplies to temporary distribution points close to the front. Medical units set up dressing stations in sheltered clearings, with evacuation by litter and then by vehicle or aircraft to rear area hospitals. Preventive measures against malaria and other diseases were emphasized, as casualties from illness could approach combat losses in this environment if left unchecked. Japanese formations faced a more severe logistical situation, with barge lines along the coast under pressure and overland routes exposed to air attack. Rations often arrived in reduced quantities or not at all. Soldiers resorted to dividing rice into smaller daily portions, supplementing with locally gathered food when possible. Ammunition for machine guns and mortars was conserved for planned assaults or defensive stands, leaving many engagements to be fought primarily with rifles and grenades. Medical support, limited in personnel and supplies, struggled to treat both combat wounds and diseases in forward areas, contributing to a gradual decline in combat effectiveness, even where unit cohesion remained intact. Command structures responded to these pressures by modifying how they used available forces. On the U.S. side, regimental commanders increasingly employed a pattern of holding key terrain with relatively thin static defenses while using mobile reserves to counter local Japanese advances. Companies were rotated where possible to reduce continuous frontline exposure, although the scale of the operation meant that some units remained engaged for extended periods. Liaison officers and forward observers were pushed closer to the front to shorten the time between contact reports and artillery or air support, refining coordination between ground and supporting arms. Japanese commanders, recognizing the attrition their leading regiments were suffering, attempted to redistribute burden among units. Battalions that had borne the brunt of earlier assaults were sometimes pulled back a short distance to reorganize, while fresher elements of the 66th Infantry Regiment were brought forward. However, the overall shortage of supplies and the distance from the main base at Wewak limited the extent to which this rotation could restore fighting strength. Strategic directives still emphasized offensive action, leaving relatively little scope for a deliberate transition to a defensive posture that might have conserved manpower. Psychological adaptation was evident in how individual soldiers and small units approached their tasks. American troops became increasingly accustomed to operating in small, dispersed groups with limited visibility, relying on sound, prearranged signals, and compass bearings rather than clear front lines. Training and experience from earlier New Guinea operations helped some formations adjust more quickly to these conditions, though newcomers to the theater had to learn under fire. For Japanese soldiers, long marches reduced rations, and repeated engagements produced cumulative fatigue, but many continued to view the offensive as an opportunity to impose costs on the Allied advance and fulfill expectations of persistence despite material disadvantage. Both sides also adjusted their use of local knowledge. Allied units worked with Papuan and New Guinean guides and carriers who knew secondary tracks and waterways, improving the speed and accuracy of patrols and supply movements. Japanese units, drawing on earlier occupation experience and contacts with local inhabitants east of the Driniumor, used existing village paths and gardens as temporary bases, though increasing Allied control of the coastal area reduced the scope of this practice. Civilians, in turn, adapted by shifting settlements, hiding food stores, or aligning their assistance with whichever force held local dominance at a given moment, seeking to minimize exposure to reprisals or demands. By late July, the cumulative effect of these adjustments was visible in the pattern of combat. Engagements became less about fixed lines and more about a series of local thrusts, ambushes, and counter-thrusts across a depth of several kilometers. U.S. units increasingly combined infantry maneuver with rapid pre-planned artillery responses, while Japanese forces used night movement and concealment to approach as close as possible before revealing their positions. The battle thus entered a phase in which both armies were no longer simply executing initial plans, but actively reshaping their methods to cope with the terrain, the enemy, and the constraints imposed by their respective supply systems. The turning point of the Driniumor campaign came when U.S. command shifted from containment to a coordinated counteroffensive designed to envelop Japanese forces west of the river. Planning during late July for an advance from the northern coastal sector took concrete form in early August, when the 124th and 169th Infantry Regiments were ordered to recross the Driniumor, move eastward, and then pivot south and west. The intention was to place substantial U.S. forces astride the inland tracks, feeding Japanese units engaged around Afua, effectively reversing the original direction of the offensive. Crossings began along selected points north of the earlier breach, using assault boats, improvised rafts, and fords identified by reconnaissance patrols. Engineers and infantry cooperated to establish small bridgeheads on the eastern bank under cover of artillery and mortar fire. Once footholds were secure, battalions advanced in column through the jungle, marking routes with tape and cutting paths for supporting weapons. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters at a time as units navigated ridges, swamps, and creek lines, with the dual task of maintaining cohesion and avoiding ambush. For Japanese forces, this new movement altered the geometry of the battle. Until then, the main effort had been oriented westward, from the Wewak hinterland across the Driniumor toward Aitape. Now reports began to reach regimental and divisional headquarters that American troops were operating east of the river and threatening to approach from the north and northeast. Forward Japanese battalions, already committed against positions around Afua and along the western approaches, risked having their lines of communication compromised if the U.S. thrust reached key junctions, such as Neoman Creek and inland village sites used as supply points. The counteroffensive unfolded in stages. Initial U.S. contact with Japanese forces east of the Driniumor consisted of brief engagements with outposts and small detachments guarding tracks and camp areas. Artillery observers, moving with the infantry, called down fire on identified positions before assault elements closed in. As the American columns advanced deeper, they began to encounter more substantial resistance from companies and battalions positioned to delay their progress. The effect was to draw Japanese units away from the Afua sector and force them to fight on a new axis, dividing their attention and diluting their capacity to maintain pressure on the original objectives. Communications and logistics shaped how quickly each side could respond. U.S. battalions advancing from the new bridgeheads remained within range of supporting artillery west of the river, which could fire over the Driniumor and onto targets designated by forward observers. Air support, though constrained by weather and canopy cover, provided additional strikes against identified supply points and movement corridors. Japanese forces, by contrast, had to rely on runners and limited radio communication to adjust dispositions. The already stretched supply system now had to support both forward elements near Afua and troops engaged against the new American thrust, increasing the strain on transport and ration distribution. As the U.S. advance east of the river gained depth, its effects became visible in the pattern of Japanese activity west of the Driniumor. Reports from American units holding defensive positions around Afua indicated a gradual reduction in the scale and frequency of Japanese attacks. Patrols found abandoned positions and evidence of hurried movement, such as discarded equipment and shallow graves along tracks leading back toward the river. Prisoners and captured documents suggested that units from the 20th and 41st Divisions were receiving orders to withdraw or reorient to face the new threat from the north and northeast. For soldiers on the ground, the turning point was experienced less as a single moment than as a gradual shift in initiative. American platoons that had spent July reacting to attacks and holding improvised lines now found themselves advancing more often than retreating, searching for enemy positions rather than waiting for assaults. Japanese infantry, many already weakened by prolonged operations and reduced rations, increasingly moved under orders to disengage, regroup, or establish delaying positions instead of pushing further toward Aitape. Civilian observations, where recorded, reflected the same movement pattern. Local inhabitants and carriers reported increased Japanese traffic eastward, away from areas that had seen the heaviest fighting earlier in the month. Some villagers encountered American patrols in places that had previously been under firm Japanese control, signaling a reconfiguration of the front that altered which authority they had to deal with for requisitions or security. The shifting lines brought short-term uncertainty, but also indicated that the main direction of movement was now back toward the Wewak region, rather than deeper into the Aitape hinterland. By mid-August, the combined effect of the northern counteroffensive and sustained pressure around Afua had produced a clear inflection in the campaign. Japanese commanders faced a choice between holding exposed forward positions with dwindling supplies or withdrawing to avoid encirclement east of the Driniumor. U.S. forces, though still contending with difficult terrain and casualties, had regained operational control of the initiative, shaping where and how further engagements would occur. The battle was not yet over, but the attempt to drive west in strength toward Aitape had been checked, and the momentum of the operation had begun to move in the opposite direction. In early August 1944, the shift in initiative along the Driniumor translated into concrete changes on the ground. As the northern counteroffensive deepened and attacks around Afua diminished, U.S. patrols found more abandoned Japanese positions and evidence of hasty movement eastward. By August 4th, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi had issued orders for a general withdrawal toward the Wewak area, instructing his divisions to break contact, recross the Driniumor where possible, and fall back along interior routes rather than continue attempts to push toward Aitape. Japanese units began to disengage in stages, leaving rear guards to slow U.S. pursuit while the main bodies moved into the Torricelli foothills and toward the Dandrawad River line. U.S. forces responded with controlled pursuit rather than a rapid advance. elements of the 124th and 169th Infantry Regiments, already operating east of the Driniumor, continued to press south and east against rearguard positions, while units west of the river advanced to reoccupy Afua and the tracks leading back toward the original line. During this phase, the mission shifted from preventing a breakthrough to ensuring that withdrawing Japanese formations could not regroup close enough to threaten Aitape again. Contact took the form of small firefights around creek crossings, village sites, and ridge lines rather than large-scale assaults, as Japanese rearguards sought to delay without becoming encircled. Relief of combat units began even as the pursuit continued. From early August, regiments of the U.S. 43rd Division, including the 103rd, 169th, and 172nd Infantry Regiments, moved into the sector to take over from heavily used units such as the 127th and 128th Infantry Regiments. By mid-August, the 43rd Division was carrying out most of the patrolling eastward toward Marubian, Charov, Jaluf, and the Driniumor River, while previously engaged formations were withdrawn to rest areas around Aitape. This rotation allowed the command to maintain pressure on Japanese rearguards while beginning to reconstitute units for future operations elsewhere in the Southwest Pacific. For Japanese formations, the withdrawal was marked by severe attrition. The 20th and 41st Divisions and attached units had suffered more than 8,000 casualties in the Driniumor Aitape area between April and late August, including large numbers dead from wounds, disease, and malnutrition, as well as those killed in direct combat. Company and battalion officer cadres had been heavily depleted, with many small units led by non-commissioned officers or senior enlisted men during the retreat. The surviving troops moved in scattered groups along jungle tracks toward Waywalk, often short of food and medical supplies, with some parties reduced to subsistence foraging as they made their way back to reassembly areas. American casualty reporting for the operation was consolidated as the pursuit tapered off. By August 25th, when the battle was officially declared over, U.S. forces had recorded approximately 440 killed, 2,550 wounded, and 10 missing in the Aitape Driniumor fighting. These losses were concentrated in units that had held the river line and contested Afua, notably the 112th Cavalry, 124th Infantry, and 169th Infantry Regiments. In comparison, American counts for Japanese losses in the Aitape area from 22nd April to 25th August listed 8,821 killed and 98 captured, reflecting both the intensity of combat and the effect of supply shortages and illness on the 18th Army's strength. Local civilians experienced the immediate aftermath as a combination of military disengagement and continuing disruption. Villages near the former front line along the Driniumor, around Afua, and along coastal tracks had been used by both armies as temporary bases and supply points. With Japanese forces moving east and U.S. patrols pushing forward more cautiously, some inhabitants began returning to abandoned gardens and houses, while others remained in temporary camps established earlier in the campaign. Damaged crops, abandoned tools, and the presence of unexploded ordnance and shallow combat graves complicated the resumption of everyday activities, and some communities continued to depend on rations or assistance from nearby Allied bases. Operationally, the withdrawal reshaped the deployment of both commands. Adachi relocated his headquarters to the Waywalk area, where surviving elements of the 18th Army began to reorganize around new defensive positions along the coast and inland approaches. The 51st Division, already in the region, and the remnants of the 20th and 41st Divisions redistributed between areas such as Butt, Dagwa, Maprik, and the Anum River Balif sector, preparing for a largely defensive phase of the war in northern New Guinea. U.S. forces, having secured the Aitape perimeter and pushed the main Japanese formations beyond immediate striking distance, shifted emphasis to base defense and limited patrolling, while higher headquarters considered how and when to redeploy major units toward operations in the Philippines. The formal end of the battle was set at 25th August 1944, when U.S. 6th Army Commander Lieutenant General Walter Kruger halted the forward advance after contact was lost with the main Japanese body near the Driniumor River. From that point, the Ayatape area functioned as a secure Allied base, and subsequent large-scale ground operations against the Japanese 18th Army in the region would be conducted primarily by Australian forces in the Ayatape-Wewak campaign, beginning later in 1944. For participants on both sides, however, the aftermath remained immediate, recovering from weeks of fighting, reorganizing depleted units, and confronting the longer-term consequences of the Driniumor engagement in terms of health, morale, and the strategic situation along the New Guinea coast. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Driniumor River had effects that reached beyond the immediate Ayatape sector. In operational terms, the outcome confirmed that the Ayatape base and its airfields would remain secure as a hinge on the Allied line of communications along the New Guinea coast. With Japanese forces pushed back beyond direct striking distance and their offensive capacity in the region markedly reduced, U.S. planners could treat Ayatape as a stable rear area rather than a contested forward outpost. This made it easier to redeploy experienced formations toward later operations in the Philippines and to assign responsibility for the remaining ground fighting in northern New Guinea to Australian forces. For the Japanese 18th Army, the campaign marked a major reduction in combat strength and mobility. The decision to commit several divisions to an offensive across the Driniumor resulted in significant casualties and further depletion of supplies that could not be replaced from the home islands under prevailing naval and air conditions. When surviving elements reorganized around Wewak and the Torricelli ranges, they did so with fewer trained officers, reduced artillery, and limited transport. Subsequent operations in the region, particularly the Ayatape-Wewak campaign conducted largely by Australian units, confronted an opponent whose capacity for large-scale maneuver had been sharply reduced by the earlier attempt to seize the initiative at Ayatape. The battle also influenced doctrinal assessments on both sides. U.S. and Australian staff studies of the Driniumor fighting drew attention to the importance of flexible defense in depth, the integration of river lines into broader maneuver plans rather than treating them as absolute barriers, and the value of combined arms in jungle terrain. After-action reports highlighted the effectiveness of artillery and air support when closely coordinated with infantry patrols, as well as the difficulties of maintaining situational awareness when front lines were fragmented. For Japanese analysts where such reviews could be carried out, the battle underscored the risks of committing substantial infantry formations to an offensive without secure supply and reliable communications, even when operating in close terrain that had previously favored infiltration tactics. Economic and logistical dimensions formed part of the longer-term significance. For the Allies, holding Ayatape and neutralizing the nearby Japanese formations supported a strategy of bypass and isolation directed against major bases such as Wewak and Rabaul. By forcing the 18th Army onto the defensive around Wewak with reduced supplies, the Allies contributed to a pattern in which Japanese units across the theater were increasingly confined to pockets where they had to devote much of their effort to subsistence. For Japan, the loss of men and materiel at the Driniumor further strained already stretched shipping, air transport, and medical resources that could not easily be diverted from other fronts. At the level of individual experience, the battle shaped the memories of soldiers and local inhabitants. Veterans of the U.S. 32nd and 43rd Divisions, and of units such as the 112th Cavalry, regarded the Driniumor campaign as one of their most demanding jungle operations, characterized by night fighting, dispersed positions, and protracted exposure to climate and disease. Japanese survivors from the 20th, 41st, and associated regiments carried memories of long marches with limited rations, repeated assaults across difficult rivers, and withdrawal through areas previously occupied. Papuan and New Guinean communities in the Ayatape Driniumor region, whose villages and gardens had been used as bases and battlegrounds, faced post-war tasks of reconstruction in landscapes that still contained abandoned equipment, unexploded ordnance, and war graves. In post-war historiography, the Battle of the Driniumor River occupies a position that varies by national perspective. In many general accounts of the Pacific War, it appears as part of the sequence of New Guinea operations leading toward the Philippines, often summarized more briefly than larger engagements such as Leyte Gulf or the battles of the Central Pacific. In Australian and U.S. specialist studies of the New Guinea campaign, it receives more detailed treatment as a case study in riverline defense, jungle logistics, and the interaction between local operations and theater-level strategy. Japanese histories of the 18th Army's experience regard the Ayatape offensive and the subsequent withdrawal as important stages in the Army's transition from offensive to defensive operations in New Guinea. Commemoration has reflected these differing emphases. War cemeteries and memorials in Papua New Guinea, Australia, Japan, and the United States include references to the Driniumor and the Ayatape sector as part of broader recognition of the New Guinea campaigns. Ceremonies and veteran accounts have tended to focus on service and endurance rather than on specific tactical episodes, consistent with the wider pattern of remembrance for remote jungle operations. Local markers and oral histories in the Ayatape region preserve knowledge of where fighting occurred, how villages were affected, and how the landscape was reshaped by the presence of opposing armies. Historically, the battle's significance lies in how it illustrates the mid-war balance in the Southwest Pacific. By mid-1944, Allied forces increasingly combined superior logistics and mobility with growing air and naval control, while Japanese commands attempted to offset material disadvantages through concentrated infantry operations in difficult terrain. The Driniumor campaign shows how these approaches interacted when a relatively isolated Japanese army chose to launch an offensive against a well-supplied but geographically constrained Allied base. Its outcome contributed to confirming the trajectory of the New Guinea theater, a gradual shift from contested advances to the containment of isolated Japanese forces, while major Allied operations moved north and west toward the central Philippines and beyond.